Delightful. Really delightful. I'm the Glub Gabgala. I love books. And this basement is a true treasure trove.
You see that? That's like me as a child. Reading was something I loved to death when I was younger. Whether it was because of school or just because I fancied it, I was never without a book to read at night before I went to bed while I was growing up. Whether it was a few pages or a few chapters, nothing settled me more than being sucked into a world woven entirely by words. I've read my fair share of big boy books, as well as more child-friendly literature. The likes of An Inspector Calls, Animal Farm, Harry Potter, Of Mice and Men, Charlie Higson's The Enemy, The Fire Within saga, the list goes on. Unfortunately though, as I've gotten older, I've found myself becoming less and less like the yeast of thoughts and minds, as, regrettably, I found myself taking less and less time to actively dedicate to reading, and nowadays, it's something I rarely find myself doing. Reading is very much a summer activity for me now. Whether I'm sat in the garden with my shorts on, bevs akimbo, or round a holiday pool somewhere, it's the only time of year I afford myself time to read. The most recent thing I read was Volume 2 of Scooby-Doo Apocalypse, and aside from that, the last book I finished that wasn't a graphic novel or manga was Eddie Guerrero's autobiography, which I finished reading over a year ago now. Despite the fact that reading isn't really a huge part of my life anymore, there is one story in particular that has stuck with me. But that's not because of the book itself. I read the story of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory because I loved the film so much. The 1971 original is among the roster of films I watched incessantly as a child, right alongside the likes of Tarzan, The Emperor's New Groove, Rugrats in Paris, Space Jam, A Bug's Life, and literally anything Scooby-Doo, which no doubt drove my family members to drink. For a child, the film is fun because it's based on a children's book, with whimsy which feels just real enough because of the time it was made, and a story that follows the book just closely enough to keep kids engaged. When watching it as an adult though, I appreciate it for different things. The dry wit, the film's pacing, Gene Wilder's pitch-perfect performance as a wily yet cynical Willy Wonka, and, which is most impressive to me, the fact that the first 50% of the film is pretty much all original material. From the songs, to the ticket hunt, to the stuff with Charlie's family, none of it's in the original story, yet it fits into the film so seamlessly. Obviously, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Cheer Up Charlie is a huge moment in cinema's history, but the rest of the stuff that's added to bulk out the original story, which is really quite short when you go and read it yourself, is quite frankly excellent. It's, to me, a pretty flawless and absurdly enjoyable film, and apparently the folks over at Soft Option in 1985 shared similar sentiments, as they made a video game for the ZX Spectrum based on the film, which is one part arcade-style minigames with each of the naughty children, and the other part 2D platformer with Charlie himself as he traverses the factory. As you've no doubt guessed though, given the fact that in '85 I don't even think I was a glint in my dad's eye, this isn't what I was intending to discuss today. In fact, what I want to talk about isn't anything to do with this version of Charlie's story. The 2005 version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is a film I'm comparatively much less enthusiastic about. On paper, it should be a film I love. Growing up, I was huge on Tim Burton because, well, you can probably guess why. And him doing his own take on what probably is my favourite book should be something I totally dig, right? Unfortunately, I think it, and Depp as Wonka for that matter, go a little bit too far in pursuit of being like, ooh, look, what odd and quirky man who makes sweeties in his lair. Watch out, he's really awkward and wacky and just like outright nasty sometimes? I don't know, I get Wilder's Wonka has an edge to him, but his behaviours are a result of his love for his career mixed with a distrust of those around him, as well as a healthy helping of worldly cynicism. This manifests for him as apathy, and only the occasional outburst of anger when he feels his expectations, or lack thereof I suppose, are proven to be true, but never is he weird, rude, or just a dickhead for the sake of it. This is in direct contrast to Depp's Wonka, who feels like he's just being weird and awkward for the sake of it. Sure, he lives alone in the factory, but the film doesn't pin his weirdness on that explicitly. Instead, it says he's an oddball because his dad didn't let him eat sweets when he was little. Okay. All that aside, I just find the film to be a chunk less charming than when the same story was told 30 years prior. I think the casting is fine, I think the use of effects is fine, I enjoy the soundtrack quite a lot, I'll admit, but oddly, I think that the surreal elements of the 2005 film make it feel strangely less fantastical than the more practical and grounded 1971 interpretation. But enough about film, I'm a gamer. I don't have time to sit in a comfy chair, stare at a big screen and ponder bollocks. I've got to get back to the important stuff, like sitting in my bedroom, looking at my TV and pondering why exactly a team of game designers thought it would be appropriate to bring Willy into the third dimension. Honestly, because of the more exaggerated and, I guess, cartoonish feel of Burton's Wonka, I think it would be more appropriate to make a game based on that version of Dahl's classic as opposed to the more grounded 1971 film, and I hope everyone involved in the ZX Spectrum game, now that I've said this, feels incredibly silly. A week before the film based on it would debut in the UK, the sensible people at High Voltage Software, who I guess just really like making licensed games based on their portfolio, presented to us Charlie and the Chocolate Factory for home consoles, with 2K handling a Game Boy Advance version. The GBA version is a 2D platformer, which personally I've never played, because my Game Boy Advance was reserved for the good stuff. Mostly Pokemon, Sonic Advance 3, Scooby-Doo 2 Monsters Unleashed, a myriad of licensed games. I sorta gave up pretending I had standards like halfway through that sentence, didn't I? The PS2 version was something I found, fittingly enough, in a bookshop when I was on a family day out to Durham. My gran was browsing the books, I spied the game, and I left the proud owner of this, while my gran left empty-handed. I remember being excited to play it, initially based solely on the fact that it was a Willy Wonka game, and thinking that the game, on the whole, was fine. After a few years of owning the game and not beating it, however, I ended up lending it to a relative, and then proceeded to forget I'd done so for years. It was only recently that I got the game back, and replaying this game for the first time in a decade reinforced one fact for me. My skill at video games as a child was incredibly subjective, and this, unfortunately, was not one of the games I was stellar at when I was younger. I have an incredibly vivid memory of me and my aunt sat on my bedroom floor trying to get through to one of those video game helplines they advertised in the back of instruction manuals as we couldn't figure out the solution to one of the puzzles in the first level. But that was then, and this is now. I'm older, wiser, and have a few more tinnies nowadays, so I think I'm a bit better equipped to play and beat this children's game from over 15 years ago than I was as an idiot infant. And who knows, since the way I look at games has changed a lot over the past decade, maybe I'll discover something I can appreciate this game for, which I wouldn't have seen or even thought about the last time I played it. The story of the game opens on little Charlie Bucket, a polite, lovely and well-spoken young man whose family's down on their luck. They're poor, all live in the same house, and Charlie does all he can to help his family get by. He dreams of one day visiting the mysterious chocolate factory sitting in his hometown and... okay, yeah, I don't need to explain this, do I? The game follows the story of the book, /film/other film. You know, poor boy receives literal golden opportunity by chance, visits a wonderful place which ultimately allows to prosper based on his good nature, while watching others who aren't so pure of heart be punished, and ultimately he achieves his dream. I'm sure pretty much everybody is familiar with this story and has experienced it one way or another. The way the game conveys its story is through these storybook style cutscenes. I know these might seem a bit lazy and a way to dodge lip syncing, but given the source material, I think they work fine enough. I quite like the art style of the cutscenes too. While the game takes the designs for the characters mostly from the film, how they're interpreted within the cutscenes is pretty nice, and I like how they're stylized. Some cutscenes found within the levels, which are typically glorified instructions, do use the in-game graphics, but I vastly prefer how the storybook ones look. The only real major change from the book itself is that the game actually tries to have some sort of antagonist. During the first level, you'll get a cutscene where Mike TV is shown to sneak off from the tour and reprogram the robots working in the factory, in an attempt to make them more efficient and impress Mr. Wonka. This, however, results in the Wonka bots going haywire and attacking the Oompa Loompas, as well as damaging the factory itself. I get that the remake has a couple throwaway lines that paint Mike as being like super smart or whatever, but look at him, man. He's not a genius, he's a gamer. He's more likely to have a Let's Play channel than a qualification in robotics. Obviously, they don't have him doing anything particularly villainous beyond this. What he does is essentially an excuse to actually have enemies in the game, as otherwise there'd just be the platforming and the puzzles, which, without interruption from said enemies, would make the game painfully short and easy. I guess if it was going to be any of the characters from the story who does something to create enemies to get in Charlie's way, I guess Mike is the best fit. Like, I couldn't see Augustus accidentally spawning an army army of chocolate boys or Veruca leading an armada of garbage men. It just feels weird that Mike has this relatively sinister vibe for this one cutscene and then nothing after that. Being a licensed game from the mid-2000s, this game is labelled as being a 3D action-adventure game. I've talked about on this channel before though how I find the label adventure game to be incredibly non-specific. Personally, I'd classify the game more as an action game with considerable puzzle and platforming elements. You control Charlie through each of the 4 main levels, solving puzzles to fix issues within the factory caused by either the Wonka bots or inadvertently by the other children as you navigate these linear stages. To help him do this, Charlie's got a fairly wide arsenal of moves which expand as the game progresses. To start, he can only jump and throw everlasting gobstoppers as a projectile to either extract collectibles or damage enemies. These collectibles come in the form of different candies which, if you find them all within a given segment of the level, will expand either your candy meter or your health. To be completely blunt, you never need to do this. Never was there a point in the game where I found I was struggling to use my abilities because my candy meter, which refills automatically over time, was too low. And once you figure out how to use the gobstoppers, rock candies and exploding candies properly, enemies never really pose a threat to you. Generally speaking, the combat is pretty basic. Throw things at folks or ram into them until they lose the will and just fall over. The aforementioned rock candy and exploding candy are some of the upgrades Charlie will gain access to as the game goes on. The rock candy essentially gives you a monkey ball to move around in, increasing your speed and giving you a dash attack at the expense of some slipperier control, and the exploding candy is exactly what it sounds like, a grenade-like projectile which deals with enemies faster than the base gobstopper. Those two, alongside the jelly beanstalk candy, which ensnares enemies and is mainly used for puzzles, the candy ball, essentially the game's double jump in the form of a sweet space hopper, where you have to time your inputs to maintain your bounce as the ball will pop if you don't, which I personally found to be an incredibly neat alternative to the traditional double jump. And lastly, fizzy lifting drinks, which literally let Charlie fly around the area he's in. This is introduced pretty late in the game, so it never felt game breaking, but you can also use it when revisiting previous levels at the end of the game to quickly snag collectibles you missed the first time round. Each of the powers feels unique and wacky enough to both stand out from each other as well as feeling like a good fit for the source material. This, however, doesn't stop the rock candy and jelly beanstalk from feeling entirely contextual in how they use them. They're basically both really useful in the levels they're found in, and beyond that you'll only really use the rock candy to deal with one particular type of enemy, of which there's only 4 in the game anyway, so hey, there's that I guess. The main ability Charlie uses to fix the factory and help him progress, however, isn't one of these powers, as Charlie is also able to command the Oompa Loompas he meets within the factory. While I was initially going to compare this mechanic to Pikmin, I actually think Abe's Odyssey is the more apt comparison. You interact with the Oompa Loompas using the D-pad to give them one of 4 commands: wait, follow, and work, and holding down the corresponding direction for each of these commands will give the direction to all of them. Thing is, not every Oompa Loompa can do every job, so you'll need to use the final D-pad command to see what class your Oompa Loompa is, and whether or not they have what's needed to perform the given tasks in the area. There's a few types: basic workers, electricians, welders. You can even turn the poor little buggers into blueberries should the need arise. The catch with the residents of Lumpaland, however, is that they don't have the same movement capabilities as Charlie. They can walk to follow you, and that's it. So part of the puzzle in most areas is figuring out how to get the right Oompa Loompa to the right place. This, however, is pretty much the only part the Oompa Loompas themselves play in terms of puzzle solving. Notice earlier how I said that they help you fix the factory and progress instead of just saying they help you solve puzzles? That's because, for the most part, the Oompa Loompas are only there to activate the puzzles or open doors, and rarely are they the focus of any puzzles beyond the basic find a way to get this fellow over to this area. Outside of this, it'll be down to Charlie himself to solve the puzzles of every level once the Oompa Loompas have made the necessary preparations for him. These puzzles vary in complexity and abundance from level to level, with each of the 4 stages having a different focus based around each of the children you'll be working to help within each of them. The first level, the chocolate room, has more vertical platforming as you traverse a candy beanstalk to continually flush Augustus through the pipe systems of the factory. It also has more open areas where you find the ingredients needed to make the candy ball, and finishes with a puzzle segment about aiming candy pulps correctly to ensure consistent sweet production. The second level, the inventing room, is based more around movement puzzles. This is mainly getting Oompa Loompas to the correct places on catwalks, but towards the end also involves moving Violet herself to the correct places to move her through the factory. Level 3, the nut room, is probably the most complex of the bunch. It starts with you having to travel linear paths to round up escaped squirrels with the help of the Oompa Loompas. After this, there's a slide segment which the level uses to transition firstly to a second candy pulp puzzle to help you acquire fizzy lifting drinks, and then to an obstacle course which tests boasts that very ability, having you fly to transport Oompa-Loompas up high and across steam vents to open sections of the factory's furnaces. The level then finishes with an enemy rush where you basically just throw exploding candy at enough enemies until the game says stop. This is probably the most varied level next to the first one, and if it didn't have such a mundane and repetitive beginning and end, then I probably would have said it was my favourite. The fourth and final level, in what seems like some attempt to have a final boss, decides you've not done enough fighting at the end of the third level and has you clear 5 rooms of enemies, and then the game just kind of ends. It ditches any real semblance of platforming and puzzle solving to just be like, yeah, kill the robots and then tell the little men to work. After the ending just sort of happens, the game tells you, hey, you can replay levels with all your powers so you can snag any goodies you dodged the first time. Sure, that's good since you can breeze through the levels using the rock candy and fizzy lifting drinks to quickly grab what you missed, but I also never really felt the need to collect anything while I was playing the levels the first time round anyway, so why would I go back to grab something that just gives me a power up I didn't need and won't need now that I've beaten the game. I also think the game falls down a bit in the fact that I don't think you can realistically call any of these puzzles challenging. The only one that got my brain a-whirring was the candy pulp puzzle in the first level, and while I did enjoy solving that, the fact that in the entire game there's only one puzzle that gets you to experiment and try different solutions is a shade concerning. Even then, if by some miracle you do get stuck on any of the others, you can always press one of the triggers to get some advice from Grandpa Joe, which can range from being pretty helpful to I wish I left you at home, Grandad. What's more, there's also only 4 levels in the entire game, and while this does make sense, 4 naughty children to help and all, it's still quite a small number of areas, and the game as a whole isn't long by any stretch. In fact, all of the footage I recorded for this video only totals to just under 4 hours. If I was ranking the levels, excluding the tutorial, which is like 3 minutes long and doesn't really do much, I'd probably put them like this. I found myself almost wanting to put the nut room below the inventing room because of its boring ending and slow start, but the middle portion does just barely make up for it. Frankly though, it does feel like they used all of their best ideas in the first level. It's nothing exceptional, but it's a good length, has a good mix of puzzle solving and platforming. It reinforces really well the basics of the game you learn in the short tutorial, expanding upon what you learn there well, and gives you a good amount of time at the very start to explore the area so that you get used to Charlie and how he controls in a more relaxed space that's not constantly trying to push you forward. The rest of the levels, aside from the interesting parts in the furnace of the factory and fizzy lifting drinks room, never get quite as interesting or consistent with their ideas or design as the early game. None of them, aside from the final level, what I call bad or outright boring, but I wouldn't be surprised if the first level was the first thing they designed, and by the time they got to the 4th level they were like, what do we do now? Oh yeah, there's music in this game. Only 2 pieces really stood out to me personally, the Objective Complete jingle and the piece you're hearing now. It plays when you're exploring the chocolate room, but when I went to listen to the rest of the soundtrack and to grab music for this video, I was like, oh my god. This is actually really great stuff. It gives me big Crash to Insanity vibes, but dials up the whimsy to 11. I looked into who was involved with the soundtrack, and it was mainly done by a lady called Winifred Phillips, who'd previously, that same year, worked on the soundtrack to the original God of War, and would go on to work on the soundtracks of the Little Big Planet franchise from the second game onwards, and yeah, that totally makes sense. Honestly, if there's one thing I can outright praise about this game, it's the music. It fits the source material and the game perfectly, ramping up the tension when needed, but also keeping it lax and wondrous where it's appropriate as well. I'd very much encourage you to give it a listen. It's actually, surprisingly, excellent. With all of that out of the way, I think I've said pretty much everything I've got to say about this game. I understand that the game is designed as a quick cash grab to coincide with the film and is aimed entirely at children, but so are these. And I feel that this game has considerably less inspired design and uses its source material less effectively in comparison to all of those games that came out the same year and were also licensed games or made to tie in with other films coming out around the time. Is this game completely horrible? No, but I don't think it's fair to say the game is good either. It has its moments of interesting ideas, and again, I didn't hate my time with it, nor was I bored while playing it, but calling it anything more than fine or passable, I guess, is being incredibly generous. In truth, I feel the game feels a bit constrained by the fact that it has to stick so closely to the film with it being a direct tie-in. If it had been able to do more of its own thing, maybe explore more flaws of the factory not seen in the film, each with different challenges and puzzles to overcome, maybe have like a climax sequence at the end of the levels with the naughty children that act as pseudo-boss fights. Maybe you have to quickly solve puzzles or release pressure somehow so that Augustus doesn't end up blowing up a boiler or something, because he's putting so much pressure on the factory's internal systems. Maybe have the slide part of Veruca's level be at the end, and have you use the gobstoppers to help send you both down the right paths to avoid the factory's various furnaces. I don't know, I just feel like the game could have been so much more if they'd taken some liberties with the structure and story in the same way the original film did. Honestly, and completely personally, I've always been sort of curious as to how an Alice Madness Returns style take on the story of Charlie would end up. Despite how I feel about what the game could have been, however, I find myself feeling a little bit bitter after discovering that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory on PS2 wasn't quite as sweet as I remembered it being.